It was late in the afternoon, the kind of late where the sun hangs low and heavy behind gray clouds. The roads had turned treacherous, slick with ice, and a howling wind whipped snow into swirling gusts. My father had been on the road for hours, his car inching along in the whiteout conditions. He had driven through miles of desolate highways, the kind where you couldn't tell where the road ended and the horizon began. A storm had hit, and it had come fast, quicker than the news had predicted. The wind was relentless, biting at his face, and the snow clung to the windshield, turning his vision into a blur. His headlights barely cut through the snow as he tried to stay on course, but the road had become a sheet of ice, and every turn was a gamble. The temperature had dropped sharply, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and makes every movement feel like a struggle. The car's engine sputtered as it fought against the bitter chill, its temperature gauge slowly creeping into the red. He had never planned on being stuck in a snowstorm like this, miles from the nearest gas station or service area. His phone had died hours ago, and with no way of calling for help, he was left with nothing but the storm and the increasingly empty stretch of road. The engine died. The car jerked and stuttered to a halt, right there in the middle of nowhere. He muttered a curse under his breath, tapping the steering wheel in frustration. The snow was coming down so thick now that he could barely see the outline of the road in front of him. He sat for a moment, the eerie silence pressing in from all sides. There was no choice but to wait it out or try to make his way to safety. But with the storm in full swing and no other cars in sight, neither option felt particularly promising. Then a light broke through the snow. A set of headlights appeared in the distance, moving slowly but steadily toward him. His first thought was relief, followed by skepticism. The snow had been so thick, it had felt like he was completely alone. Still, he knew he needed help, desperately. He watched as the car approached and slowed down, coming to a stop right next to his. The man who stepped out of the vehicle looked like he'd been driving for some time. His face was pale and drawn from the cold, his features obscured by the long coat and scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. He stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached the window. "You stuck." The man's voice was deep but warm, a stark contrast to the sharp bite of the storm. "Yeah," my father replied, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "My engine died. I don't know what to do." The man looked at him with a gaze that seemed to search for something behind my father's eyes. "I can give you a ride," he said, his tone light but with an undertone of seriousness. "I know this storm is coming down hard. You shouldn't be out here in it." At first, my father hesitated. The world outside the car was a sea of white, and he didn't want to risk getting lost on foot or worse. But the man's offer seemed genuine enough, and what choice did he have? He couldn't stay in the car forever. After a brief moment of hesitation, he nodded. "Okay, thank you." The man gave him a smile, a reassuring one, as he opened the passenger door for him. The interior of the car was warm, the heater blasting air that felt like a relief to my father's chilled skin. The man's car was a nondescript sedan, and as my father sat down, he noticed how quiet it was inside. It was almost too quiet. There was no radio, no chatter, just the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the suspension over the snow. "Where are you headed?" the man asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Just trying to get out of the storm," my father said, glancing over at him. The man didn't answer right away. His gaze focused on the road, which was becoming increasingly difficult to see through the thickening snow. As the minutes ticked by, the unease inside my father started to grow. The man wasn't saying much, and the silence between them started to feel heavy. My father tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to the isolation of the storm, but it persisted. He glanced out the window, watching the snowflakes dance in the wind, hoping for a sign that they were getting closer to safety. His mind began to race, searching for an explanation for the odd tension in the air. The man's calm demeanor felt off. His clothes were too neat, his movements too deliberate. There were things about him that didn't add up. The way his hands gripped the steering wheel, a little too tightly, a little too stiff. The way his eyes flicked to my father now and then, as though assessing him, studying him. "Where are you from?" My father asked, trying to break the silence. His voice was forced, and the words felt strange in the air. "Not far," the man replied, his voice curt and distant. A cold shiver ran through my father. He was being polite, he knew that, but something was gnawing at him. Something he couldn't quite place. He turned his head just slightly, studying the man's profile. The skin around his jawline was rough, unshaven, and something about his eyes didn't seem right. It was as though he was hiding something dark, behind that calm, collected facade. But then, just as the unease reached its peak, the man broke the tension with a friendly tone. "We're getting close," the man said, his eyes scanning the road. "I know a place just up ahead where you can get warm and wait for the storm to pass. It's a diner, always open, even in weather like this." My father wasn't sure what to think. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the gesture, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The diner didn't sound like the kind of place someone would just know about, but it seemed like a safer bet than staying on the road. "That sounds good," my father replied, trying to mask his hesitation. The man nodded and turned the car down a narrow, snow-covered road that my father hadn't even noticed before. The diner was small but warm, glowing with light from inside. The man pulled up to the entrance, stopping just short of the door. "Here we are," he said with a kind smile. "Get inside, get some food, and wait for the snow to die down." My father hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should thank him or ask for more details. But before he could speak, the man spoke again, almost like an afterthought. "Don't worry, you'll be safe here. It's a small place, but they've got a big heart. Good people, you know?" The kindness in his voice made my father's nerves feel more like an overreaction, though he still couldn't shake the odd feeling that lingered in the back of his mind. "Thanks," my father finally said, getting out of the car. "I'll be okay." The man smiled, tipping his hat. "Take care of yourself, all right?" With that, the man drove off, disappearing into the snowstorm as if he were just another shadow in the storm. My father watched him go, the quiet hum of the diner's neon lights providing a strange sense of comfort. He walked inside, where the warmth enveloped him, and the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. A waitress greeted him with a smile, and he found himself a seat by the window, watching the snow continue to fall outside. It wasn't until hours later, when the storm had passed, that my father would learn the truth. The news had reported the arrest of a man in connection to several unsolved disappearances across the state. The details of the man's past were chilling. He had a history of offering rides to stranded motorists, only to never be seen again. His kindness was a mask, carefully constructed to lull his victims into a false sense of security. But for my father, the realization came too late. The man who had been so kind, so thoughtful, had been a killer, a serial killer, offering warmth in the storm, but hiding darkness beneath the surface. As my father sat in the diner that night, the weight of his narrow escape pressed down on him. He hadn't known it then, but the kindness of a stranger had almost cost him everything. It was one of those nights when you just wanted to keep driving, let the never-ending highway consume you, taking you deeper into the darkness. My band, the Hollow Echoes, had just wrapped up a long set at a small venue about 50 miles back. We were on our way to the next town, but the storm had rolled in with a vengeance. The rain hammered down in sheets, the kind that made the road slick, and the headlights barely cut through the thick blackness. The van hummed along the highway, the tires gripping the wet asphalt, as we passed fields that stretched on for miles. It was quiet inside, none of us in the mood to talk. We were all exhausted from the show, ready to get to the next stop and catch some sleep. But then, up ahead, the headlights caught something strange, neon lights flickering on the side of the road. "Is that a bar?" Charlie, our drummer, asked, squinting through the rain-soaked window. I looked ahead and nodded. Could be. None of us were particularly in the mood for a stop, but we were running low on gas, and the next town was still a long way off. We'd need to fill up before we could continue. I glanced at the gas station on the right side of the road, right next to the bar. The storm was only getting worse, and the wind whipped the rain against the windows. "Let's just get gas and get out of here," I muttered, already pulling the van off the highway. The tires screeched as I turned onto the gravel driveway of the gas station. The station itself wasn't anything special, a small, run-down place with a single flickering light above the pumps. We pulled up to the pump, and I stepped out to fill the tank. As I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was wrong. The storm was growing louder, the wind howling. The lights of the bar next door flickered like they were on their last legs, and I couldn't help but glance at the neon sign, the Lost Cantina. The cantina part of the sign seemed to be struggling to stay lit, giving the whole place an eerie, faded feel, like it was stuck in a different time. Mark, our guitarist, was the first to speak. "I've got a bad feeling about this," he muttered, watching the flickering neon lights. "Do you guys see that?" Charlie and I both looked, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was the storm messing with my head or something more. But then I shrugged it off. "We'll be fine. We just need gas." We finished filling the van, and I swung open the door to get back inside. Mark was still eyeing the bar suspiciously. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice low. "It feels off." Charlie grinned. "What, you think the bar's haunted or something? It's just a shitty dive. Let's get this over with." We all piled back into the van, and despite the growing unease, I started the engine and pulled into the parking lot right in front of the Lost Cantina. The place looked like it had seen better days, rusting tin roof, peeling paint. But the neon lights outside gave it an oddly magnetic pull, like it was trying to drag us in. Mark was the first to speak, his voice quiet. "Maybe we just get gas and go, huh?" But Charlie had already opened his door and was stepping out, shrugging as he grinned at us. "What's the worst that could happen, right?" I sighed and followed Charlie out of the van, though my unease was growing. It didn't help that the air felt thicker than usual, like the atmosphere itself was pushing down on us. The door creaked open as we walked inside, and a cold draft swept through the entrance. The lighting was dim, the kind of flickering light that made everything feel older than it probably was. The smell hit me next: stale beer, cigarette smoke, and something metallic. The whole place had a sense of decay, like it was slowly being swallowed by time. Inside, there were only a handful of people sitting at booths, hunched over, their faces hidden in shadow. The murmur of their conversations mixed with the eerie hum of an old jukebox playing a warped, distorted tune. For a moment, I just stood there, staring, unsure if I wanted to move any further. The bartender, a stocky man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, barely looked up when we approached. His eyes were dark, and his voice came out raspy like he hadn't spoken in years. "Whatcha want?" he asked, barely even acknowledging our presence. I glanced around, trying not to stare too hard at the patrons. Some of them had strange, almost alien features, elongated faces, bizarre clothes that didn't fit in with the bar's shabby look. There was one guy sitting in the corner, dressed in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, looking completely out of place. His eyes were distant, blank. It all felt off. Charlie leaned over to me and whispered, "This place is weird, man." I nodded. "I feel it too." Mark seemed restless, glancing back at the door and then down at his phone. "I don't know, guys. Something feels wrong." But we were already here, and despite the oddness of the place, we were all too tired to turn around now. I ordered drinks for the group, nothing fancy, just whatever the bartender had to offer. He slid a pair of glasses our way, filled with something murky and unidentifiable. "On the house," he said, with a strange smile. "Don't ask what it is." We didn't ask, but we took the drinks and wandered to a booth in the far corner. We sat down, the low hum of the jukebox continuing to fill the silence. It wasn't long before I noticed Mark wasn't himself. His eyes were glazed over, his face flushed, and he was moving slower than usual. I could tell something was off, but I couldn't figure out exactly what. "Hey, Mark, you good?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. He nodded slowly, his grin widening unnaturally. "Yeah, man, I'm good. I'm just feeling good." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "You don't look so good, man. You sure you're okay?" But Mark just laughed, his voice sounding strange. "I'm fine. I'm great." Something wasn't right. I shot a glance at Charlie, who was now watching Mark with suspicion. "Did you feel anything weird after drinking that?" Charlie whispered, his voice tight with worry. "I don't know," I said, my gut sinking. "Maybe it's the vibe of the place, but I don't like this." Mark had always been the cool one, the one who never let anything get to him. But now he was acting different. It wasn't just the tiredness from the show. There was something else in his eyes, something distant, like he wasn't here anymore. Charlie stood up, his eyes narrowed. "I'll be right back. I'm going to check something." He walked up to the bar, speaking to the bartender for a moment. When he came back, his face was pale, and there was a tremor in his voice. "Dude, I think they slipped something in Mark's drink," he said, glancing around nervously. I talked to the bartender. He didn't even act surprised when I asked him about it. Just shrugged it off. "Shit," I muttered, my stomach dropping. "We need to get him out of here, now." I stood up, ready to grab Mark, but just then, the door, the one that had creaked open when we first arrived, refused to budge. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could hear, whispering in the distance, soft murmurs that seemed to be coming from nowhere. The walls felt like they were closing in on us. Then, from the far corner, a low growl echoed through the air. A man with a scarred face stepped forward, his eyes dark, filled with malice. He grinned at us, his teeth sharp, his voice a low hiss. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his words heavy with menace. Mark, still grinning like a man possessed, stood up slowly. "I don't want to leave," he murmured, his voice distant. "This place feels right." Charlie grabbed my arm. "We need to snap him out of it. He's not himself." I looked at Mark, who was swaying, his expression vacant, and I realized this wasn't just the drink. There was something darker at play here. The patrons were all watching now, their eyes vacant, their faces twisted in ways that didn't seem human. Without another word, I grabbed Mark and tried to pull him away from the table. We shoved our way past the crowd, and with one final push, I threw the door open. It creaked wide, and we bolted outside, into the pouring rain. We didn't stop running until we reached the van, where Charlie quickly yanked the door open. Mark stumbled into the back seat, dazed but slowly coming back to himself as the cool air hit his face. We didn't say anything as we pulled out of the parking lot and drove off, leaving the Lost Cantina behind. But the feeling of being trapped in that place, of something darker lurking inside, stayed with us long after we left. We never spoke of the bar again. But every now and then, when we're driving through the night, we wonder, had it really been the drink that took hold of Mark, or was something far worse at play? And if we ever find ourselves on that road again, we know we'll never stop again. The party in the woods had been perfect at first. Laughter, music, the hum of neon lights strung between the trees. It was supposed to be a celebration, a few hours of reckless fun in the middle of nowhere. But then the sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the night like a knife. The flashing red and blue lights seeped through the trees, casting eerie glows on the dark trunks. "Shit, it's the cops!" Duane shouted above the music, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The crowd of people in their party clothes scattered like startled deer. Some people sprinted into the woods while others froze, unsure what to do. I grabbed Duane's arm as he pulled me toward the edge of the clearing. "We need to go," I urged, my heart already hammering in my chest. We weren't even halfway through the woods when we heard the unmistakable crack of a flashlight beam snapping through the trees, followed by the urgent shouts of officers. A few seconds later, the sounds of footsteps, too many footsteps, echoed behind us. "Run!" Duane yelled, his grip tightening around my wrist as he pulled me deeper into the woods. I didn't hesitate, my feet pounding against the undergrowth as I followed him, panic rising in my chest like bile. The sound of the music still played faintly in the background, distorted now by the distance, but the steady thudding of our heartbeats was louder. I didn't want to look back. I couldn't. The thought of getting caught, of being hauled back to the party in handcuffs, terrified me more than I cared to admit. We ran. We pushed through the trees, their branches scraping at our skin, the leaves underfoot crinkling like bones with every step. I was gasping for breath, the cold air biting at my lungs, but I kept running. Duane didn't say anything. He just pulled me forward, his footsteps sure and steady. But I noticed something strange in his eyes. The urgency wasn't just fear, it was desperation. We had been running for what felt like an eternity when Duane abruptly stopped. I almost collided with him, stumbling as I tried to regain my balance. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there, staring into the darkness ahead. His eyes were wide, his breathing fast. I followed his gaze, straining to see in the thick shadows, but all I saw were more trees, more dark, dense forest. "Duane," I said again, but this time my voice quivered with fear. Something wasn't right. He turned to face me. "There's something out here with us." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't ask what he meant. I just felt it. Something cold in the air, something wrong about the night. The woods around us felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Not from behind us, but ahead. Slow, deliberate steps that came from deep within the dark woods. My stomach twisted in fear. There was no mistaking it now. We weren't alone. "We have to keep moving," I whispered, but my voice felt weak, as though the forest itself was draining my strength. Duane didn't respond. He was staring at the trees, his eyes wide, filled with fear. His lips trembled, but he didn't speak. "Duane!" I hissed, shaking his arm, but he was staring at something beyond the trees, his breath ragged. I turned to follow his gaze, my heart skipping a beat. There, in the shadows of the trees, was a figure. Tall and thin, barely visible but unmistakable. It was watching us, standing motionless as if it had been there for ages. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it was something human, or something pretending to be human. "Duane?" My voice cracked. "What is that?" "I don't know," he whispered, his eyes wide in terror. "But we have to get out of here." I didn't know what he meant. I didn't want to know. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, my senses screaming that we should have kept running. But there was nowhere to go now. The figure appeared again, this time closer. I could make out its features now. Pale, gaunt skin stretched tight over its bones, hollow eyes glinting in the moonlight. Its fingers were impossibly long, curling and uncurling like twigs snapping in the wind. "Duane," my voice cracked. "What is that?" "I don't know," he whispered, his eyes wide in terror. "But we have to get out of here." Before I could ask what he meant, the creature lunged. I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the deafening rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs breaking under its weight. It was faster than anything human could ever be, its long fingers reaching for us, its mouth opening wide in an unnatural grin. But before it could grab us, there was a sudden, powerful crack. The ground itself seemed to quake, as if the forest itself was angry at the intrusion. A low, guttural sound filled the air, and the creature froze. We didn't look back. We didn't wait to see what was happening behind us. Duane pulled me forward, dragging me through the underbrush with what little strength he had left. I didn't care if I tripped or stumbled. I just wanted to get away, to leave the woods behind us. But the sounds of the forest, the footsteps, the whispers, followed us. They never stopped. They never let us forget.